I think my batteries are failing on my microphone. Batteries for my microphone. Two AA's, I think. Probably so.
You spoke up.
They're working right now. I just don't think they'll. I don't think they'll last very long. Yeah, they're blinking. Mm-hmm. All right. All right. Let's get to business. Everybody turn to the book of Judges. Book of Judges. Thought we could do a study of the book of Judges for the next several weeks, if that's all right with everybody. We'd already, this is what we're going to do. We'd already gone through the book of Joshua not too long ago, and this picks up immediately after the book of Joshua. There's virtually no time passed. So the book of Joshua finishes up, and of course at the end of Joshua, what happens? Joshua passes away, right? He goes on to his reward that's been promised him. However, the nation is left behind, and they are now waiting to find out what's going to happen. What are they going to do? And a lot of times you have to really get through the entire narrative of a book in order to really understand it. And we remember that while Joshua certainly subdued the land of Canaan, the work was not yet finished. There were still tribes and nationalities that had to be subdued, driven out from the land, or otherwise disposed of or taken care of the way that God wanted them to do that. So we're going to start, and we're just going to work our way through, and we're going to kind of go through it, not necessarily just reading every verse, but kind of looking at some details and maybe getting a little bit better idea of the book. Does that sound good to everybody? All right. So when Israel goes into the Promised Land, after they cross over the River Jordan, the work really begins. Now, they had already subdued some of the nations on the other side of the Jordan River, because the land of Israel was not defined strictly by the Jordan River. There were several of the tribes that were settled in that land before they crossed over the Jordan. But really, once they got over the Jordan River, that's when the work really began in earnest to rid the land of the inhabitants. And they were going to drive those out, and God went before them, and they subdued it to an extent. But the work was not yet finished. So this is what we're going to look at here. Okay. When the Israelites followed God's instructions, were they victorious? I was going to ask, were there any exceptions to their victories when they listened to God and obeyed His word? There were no exceptions. They won every victory. They won every battle. And in many cases, they lost very few people. They were that kind of victorious. Almost any other time, we think about how we were victorious in some of the conflicts that this country's been involved in. While we were victorious, we lost a great many people. But for the Israelites, when they were victorious, very few people lost their lives, and in some counts, none of them lost their lives, as long as they were listening to God's instruction. Now, when they went on their own wisdom, what typically happened? They were defeated at the very least. In many cases, people lost their lives that shouldn't have lost their lives. Those people should still be alive. All right. But the idea that when the Israelites followed God's instructions, they were victorious in every time in Joshua chapter 6. If we're not going to go back there, but if you want to go back and look at that, at the beginning of the very book of Joshua, he says he makes this promise: "Be strong and of good courage, for to this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to their fathers to give them." That's chapter 1 and verse 6 of Joshua. And near the end of the book, we read that God, of course, kept His word. "So the Lord gave to Israel all of the land of which He had sworn to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it and dwelt in it. Not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel. All came to pass." So, can we say this? Do you think this would be a true statement? Can we agree with that statement? Okay, it's complete. God's faithfulness is complete. If He says something, if He promises something, He delivers. Many times His promises come with conditions, don't they? All right. I think it's a good thing that when we look through the Word of God, that His promises oftentimes come with instruction. If you do this, then I will bless you. If you do not do this, or if you do something other than what I tell you, I will not bless you. In many cases, I will defeat you in my own way. You decide that you're going to do this, I will make sure that you are defeated. I'll make sure that something happens to bring you around to my way of thinking, or I'll simply take you off of the position which you enjoy at the present time. But His faithfulness in regards to His promises is without question. It is complete and it is without question. So, before Joshua's death, what does he do? He challenges the nation of Israel, doesn't he? Right? Remember the old you see it on a lot of people's houses. They have a little plaque up there, right? Choose you this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Right. Now that's a pretty strong promise. Because remember, He makes the children of Israel swear this, doesn't He? He says, choose you. It was a genuine question. It wasn't just making a statement. He's saying, choose you this day. Make your decision. What are you going to do? What did the people do? They chose to serve Him, right? We'll do it. We'll do it. Now we're going to read as we go through the book of the book of Judges that for at least a short period of time after they inhabited Canaan, they maintained their fidelity to God. Their faithfulness was without question. And we read very quickly, though, in the book of Judges that everything goes off the tracks. They decide that they're going to do other things. They're going to bring in other gods. They're going to attach themselves to the nations that surround them. And we see really quickly that the nation of Israel goes into apostasy. And we see that does not really change that much, really, until David comes into play. During the book of Judges, during the period of the Judges, the people were very, very sinful. They went away. They worshipped false gods, and we're going to see that over and over again in the book of Judges. God would appoint a judge. They would come back, and then as soon as that was taken away, they went back into sinfulness, and unfortunately, that's the problem that they had themselves with. In Joshua, somebody want to turn to Joshua chapter 24. Joshua chapter 24, verse 16 and 18. Joshua 24, verses 16 and 18. And in verse 24, and verse 31. Who's got verses 16 and 18? Joshua 24.
So the people answered and said, Lord, if the faith of the Lord, so know the God. For the Lord our God so great preserves us all the way that people whom we have. The Lord drove out before us all the wealth in the land, also serve the Lord, for He is our God.
No, that's good. That's good. 16 and 18. That's what I wanted to get at. So here, Joshua is inquiring of them what they're going to do, and they said, "Look at what he says: Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods." And at the end, they make a very clear statement: He is our God. They're making a statement of possession. He is our God. We've seen the signs that He accomplished. He took us out of that land of bondage. He's brought us to this place. They've seen all of the things that He's done, the way in which He went before them into battle, the way He which delivered their enemies to them. And they've seen everything that He's done, and they make this very clear statement: we will not serve other gods. Why would we do that? Far be it that we should do something like that. We will serve the Lord our God. Now, we think about that in regards to the statement that we make even today when we become Christians, right? Why would we serve? Far be it that we would serve another God. The Lord our God is our God. He's mine. I claim Him as my God. Now, here's the thing. Joshua, knowing their hearts, then began to question them. He warns them, the first time something happens, you're going to want to fall away from Him. You're going to want to do something else. You're going to go somewhere else. You're going to see, and he warned them about their involvement with the other nations, because he said, once you get involved with these nations, you're going to want to bring their gods in. And they're saying, no, not, absolutely not. And they make this statement in verse 24. What does he say in verse 24? Chapter 24, verse 24. Okay, so they make sure that he understands their understanding of it all. All right, they make sure that Joshua knows where they land on this. They make this decision. They've made a vow basically before God that they would serve God alone, and He would be their God. All right. In verse 31, somebody read verse 31, chapter 24, verse 31. Okay, so we see that after Joshua was gone, that the people that were there with him, and even those who survived him, continued to serve God. They kept to their vow. They made a promise that they were going to serve God and not turn away from Him, and they continued to do that, didn't they? All right, so we see that are we capable of fidelity if we choose to concentrate and work ourselves towards that fidelity? In anything, right? In anything we find ourselves in any situation we find ourselves that requires the idea of faithfulness and fidelity, we are capable of following through on that promise that we make and that decision and that course of action. The people of Israel were able to. So it makes it even more distressing when, after a period of time, as there arose a generation who were not privy to that vow. That vow stopped after a certain generation. We need to remember this, right? Even the church is only about a generation away from apostasy, isn't it? Within a short period of time, the church can go off into apostasy if we do not actively maintain our fidelity to God. If we simply allow it to become second nature to us, where we don't really put a concentration on it, it just simply exists. Is our Christianity, can our Christianity even today, can our Christianity simply exist as a part of our personality, so to speak? Can our Christianity exist? Can it continue to thrive and exist and grow if it simply is just yet another part of our being? No. It has to be something that's at the forefront of our minds all the time, right? We have to constantly be putting this forward and constantly be thinking about what we do, constantly examining ourselves and so forth and so on. All of these things, it requires a concentrated effort, right? Okay, so we read where we have this situation where the people began to go off into unfaithfulness. They began to go off into infidelity. There they were. They had all of this in front of them. They saw all of these things. Their forefathers took a vow, and now, guess what? They began to slide off. They began to err. They began to turn aside from the pathway that God has set for them. It kind of reminds me of if you go back to the book of Genesis or the book of Exodus, where Moses had brought his parents and his family down to Egypt to preserve them, and they lived there. Everything was fine. The Pharaoh swore an oath to Joseph and his parents and his kinsmen. They were going to be taken care of. They're going to be taken care of. And then if you read at the very beginning of the book of Exodus, it says, there arose a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. Well, what's happened here is there's going to arise a generation of the Israelites who did not know God. The word of God had not been kept correctly. It had not been taught to the children by the parents. And even the parents, when they heard it, were not faithful in their dealings with God and His word. Okay? So they did not keep the vow that their parents made to God when Joshua was asking them, choose you this day whom you will serve. All right. As we go through the book of Judges, we're going to notice a cycle. There's going to be it's a cyclical thing throughout the entire book of Judges. There's a cycle of disobedience. Hang on. I wrote this down. It's going to be a cycle that's going to go through the book of Judges. And it's going to begin with the disobedience. As the generations would fall away, they would go into disobedience. The disobedience took different forms at different places, but the majority of it came when they began to worship other gods. That's when most of it came into play. They began to worship other gods. They began to involve themselves in the nations that surrounded them, the idolatrous generation of the nations that surrounded them. They would go into disobedience. And then God, in order to chastise his children, as we are told the Scriptures, right? If a father loves his children, what does he do? He chastises them. He disciplines them. God's discipline came in different forms. He sent different things to them. Many times he would allow these nations that they had put their trust in their gods, and then these nations would come in and they would ransack Israel. And then God would send a deliverer, right? And that deliverer would push the people back out. The people would come back. He would give them a relief, and then they would come back to him, and then the cycle would begin over again. When that relief was taken away, they would go back into idolatry and disobedience, and then it would become punishment time, and then it would become relief time, and it was this cyclical thing that went over and over and over again. It's repeated over and over again throughout the book. It also becomes more clear. It becomes very clear that the more time passed, the longer they went, the longer they remained in the land, every successive generation became more and more wicked. That's interesting. It didn't lessen over time. It merely got worse with time. But we've seen that before in the Bible, haven't we? All right? We think about it. Think about what happened right before Noah was told to build that ark. You know, the people were in a little bit of disobedience, and then it got to the point where every thought of man was wicked continually. And then God sent punishment, didn't he? And then he brought them relief. And then every successive generation after that point become more and more wicked. And then finally he would bring them back. And he would go. We see this all the way through. I don't know if that's happening necessarily right now. I think that things have changed somewhat. I think that maybe the behavior is less openly violent. But I do believe that what's happening is we're finding a generation that's coming up, and probably even is right now, who has basically changed the definition of what is wicked and what is right. You know, before, people were wicked, but at least wickedness, they were understanding that they were wicked. They knew what they were doing was wrong. Unfortunately, what we're happening now is we're seeing a generation that's coming up and saying that what is wicked is good, and what is good is wicked. They've turned it on its ear, so to speak. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 It's possible that the generation that's coming up that may be a little wicked may have children that are wanting to return to more of a moral stance than is commonly understood right now. Possible, very possible. Numbers chapter 33 and verse 50, please. Numbers 33, 50. Just hold your place right there. All right, so we've got the people, and they are abandoning Jehovah. They're abandoning Yahweh to go for these exciting gods of the pagan nations that surround them. And you'll find in Judges, the great deal of the thrust of the book is a recall for the Israelites to reject these pagan gods and return to Yahweh. That's what they're wanting them to do. You see this through Judges and Ruth. Hey, leave these gods and come back to the one who brought you to this place. Numbers 33 and verse 50. Whoever's got that. Hang on. Make sure I've got the right one. I wrote 3350, but I may have... Give me just a second. Hang on. Let me get there. I may not have written it all down. Okay, yeah. 50 through 52. 50 through 52. Okay. So we get an instruction from God here in Numbers 33, don't we? 50 through 52. Very specific instructions, and if you look at what he tells them to do, he says, "Speak to the children of Israel speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you cross over the Jordan, then you shall do what? Drive out who? All the inhabitants. Did that leave out any of the inhabitants that were there? All of them were to be driven out. Okay, so we get the first part of this is the idea of driving them out. All right, those who would not be driven out would be put to the sword. Right? You won't leave, then we will kill you. But you have to leave. Drive them out. Push them out of the borders that I've established for you. There's a second part to this, and I believe that this is the portion that the children of Israel fell far short of. Now, they didn't follow through on driving out all of the inhabitants of Canaan. But I believe that one of their biggest mistakes was not taking the second part of this very seriously. And see, that's just why God's word must be followed in its entirety rather than simply the portion that sounds good to us at the time. The second part of that was to do what? Destroy their idols. And look what he says. Destroy all their stonework. So if they carved a god out of stone, you do what? Destroy it. What do you do with all the metal images? Destroy them, melt them down, make something else with them, whatever. They're to be destroyed as a metal image. But then it says to do what? Demolish all their high places. A high place was simply a place where that god was worshipped. That's all it means by high. Doesn't mean it was typically on maybe a raised area, but the idea of a high place means simply it was a place of worship. So you're to destroy all their stonework, destroy their metal images, and then demolish their places of worship. So when they would go into these towns, when they would drive out the inhabitants, and let's be honest, most of the people, when they heard that the Israelites were coming, they gave up any pretense of fight. It was, fight or flight. Theirs was almost exclusively flight because they knew what happened when you went up against the Israelites. Their God, Jehovah, was a mighty God, and He's going to destroy us. We don't want any part of Jehovah. If they stayed behind, listen, we'll serve you. We will be your servants. I can't. We couldn't flee, so we're going to serve you. And if they wanted to put up a fight, then they would be destroyed. But God's instructions were very clear. When you go into these towns and you take possession of these cities and these walled cities and these habitations, what are they to do? Erase any image, erase any memory that these false gods ever existed. So you can imagine what would happen. They would come into these cities and they would see these. While Joshua was in charge, what did they do? They did everything that he was supposed to do. But Joshua wasn't in charge for very long, was he? Eventually he died. And when they went into these towns, it became more, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of trouble. It certainly can't harm us. There's nothing that can be done. We don't regard these as anything of importance. and they would allow them to remain, or they would allow the people that stayed to maintain or retain these gods. So rather than doing everything that God told them to do, they didn't do everything that God told them to do. And then what does it say happened? What happens when they allow these gods to remain? Look at this. Verse 55. Verse 55 of Numbers 33, verse 55 tells us what happens then. So even as he gave them this instruction, he told them what would happen if they didn't do it. He told them. My translation, I like that translation. My translation says they will be barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they will trouble you in the land where you dwell. And what does it say? That is extremely scary. I will do to you as I meant to do to them. The whole point was he was driving out the inhabitants of Canaan because they were wicked. That's it. Had they remained faithful to God, and these people at one time they worshiped God acceptably. But over time, over the successive generations, the inhabitants of Canaan became idolatrous, and they became paganistic, and they became a stench before God. He says, I'm going to drive them out. You, Israel, are going to be my driving tool. I'm going to use you to drive out these inhabitants of Canaan. If you can't do what I tell you to do, then I'm going to do to you what I'm doing to them. What came to pass? What happened? Listen, well, right here, God's faithfulness is absolute. It is complete. It is without question. It's unquestionable. Faithfulness, a lot of times we think, well, God's being faithful is always a good thing. Is God faithful in His promises even when it's wickedness? Even when it's evil that's going to come? Yes, absolutely. He says, I will destroy you like I destroyed them. Was God faithful when He promised that? Absolutely. And He drove them out of the land. He said, I will expel you. So you can, and here's the problem. They had become so haughty in their thinking and in their look and the way they looked at things. They believed that there was nothing. They wanted all of the excitement of being a pagan idolater, but they still wanted the promise that came from being children of Jehovah. They wanted to have their cake and eat it too. But you don't understand. I'm an Israelite. I'm a son of Abraham. Nothing bad can happen. He says, you don't know who you're dealing with. You should know, but you don't know who you're dealing with. And He tore them down from that high place, and he sent them with abject humiliation. He sent them as captives into a pagan land. And here's what happened. As they would drive out the inhabitants of the land of Canaan and take their place and live in their cities and enjoy all of the fruits of their labor, that's exactly what the Babylonians did. That's what the Assyrians did. They drove them out, carried them out in bondage, and then they came in and lived in the very houses in which the Israelites had made for themselves. So as He said, I will do to you as I thought to do to them. He was absolutely 100% correct. And He was faithful in that promise. All right? So very important thing to remember when we read in the book of Judges what was happening to them, that they were receiving the just punishment for their action. Yes. How do we think we're going to escape a judgment from a God that sees all? You can't. You're not going to. How many people in the world today think they're going to escape judgment? They don't. Some of them don't even believe there's going to be a judgment. Yeah. They either think that everybody is going to heaven, or that there is no God, there's no judgment, there's no anything anyway. And when you die, you just die. Yeah. Typically, if you were religious minded, the idea of hell is way far down, and that only a few people. Apparently, according to the world, there's only going to be like 10 people in hell. It's the worst of the worst of the worst of the worst. Yes, ma'am. Right. Yeah. Right. It sounds like people, doesn't it? They want. They're. Have you ever been in a relationship where you're the giver? You're always. It seems like you're the one that makes all the effort in the relationship. You're the one that makes the phone call. You're the one that schedules the visit. You're the one that calls on birthday. You're the one that does all of this stuff. You're always the one that gives in the relationship. It seems like because I've known people like that. They sit around waiting on what are you going to do for them. And to a certain extent, and you go so far in that, don't you? We'll go so far in that, but then eventually we say, look, this is not a healthy relationship. This is not a good relationship. See, you can imagine feeling that. Can you imagine how God feels all the time? All the time. And when you have this, when you're blessing 7.5 billion people, almost 8 billion people on a daily basis, and you're doing all of these things for everyone all over the world, and then you've got a very small portion of the population who are keeping their fidelity. They're keeping their faithfulness. They're maintaining that relationship the way that He wants it to be maintained. And you think, I'm so frustrated with the rest of them, but I'm so thankful for the ones that are doing as I ask them to do. They're the ones that are being faithful, and they're the only faithful ones in this relationship. You think about Elijah, right? I'm the only one, right? Jeremiah, I'm the only one. I'm the only one. And how difficult that would be to see a nation that has said, we want all of the blessings, but we don't want any of the responsibility. It's like a lot of these young people that are they want everything in the world for themselves, but they're not willing to lift a finger to do anything for it. I say young people. There's some older folks doing the same thing, right? All right. So he says they're going to be a thorn in your side. They're going to be a snare to you. The idea of being a snare. Have you ever been caught in a trap? I've never really been caught in a trap, at least not like a real physical live trap. But you can imagine when you're caught in that trap, you can't do it. There's nothing you can do about it. And that's essentially where the Israelites found themselves time and time again. They found that they found these gods of their neighbors that were a snare to them. It was not preventing them. It was giving them an excuse not to worship Jehovah God in the way that He desired, to not follow His laws and His commandments the way they wanted to. So we find that rather than influencing the pagan nations for good, the Israelites were eventually and completely corrupted. So that kind of gives us a parallel, right, to our relationship with the world. I think I'm strong enough to be in the world but not be of the world. I can do this. I can flirt with evil. I can skirt the outskirts of sin and iniquity, but I'm not going to fall prey to it. But what happens? What happens more often than not? Yeah. We were the ones dragged in because it's exciting. That's the reason the Israelites liked it. Listen, it's like today. I had talked to people all the time. Here we are in a godly worship. Just a couple hours ago, we were in a godly worship. But how many times have you heard people say, worship's just so boring? Worship is just so boring. We need something to spice it up. Never mind that this has been a perfectly acceptable form of worship for God for 2,000 years. We got to do something new. We got to do something exciting. And that's essentially what the Israelites were. They said the worship to God was dull. But here are these pagan gods and goddesses, and they're requiring this exciting kind of worship where you jump around and you throw yourself in the air and you throw yourself on the ground, you roll around. I mean, I'm serious. They offer their sacrifices in a new and exciting way. It's strange how little things have changed over the last 4,000 or 5,000 years. We still want that. We still want the new. We still want the exciting. And that's what the Israelites had with these pagan gods. It was new and it was exciting. This is a God, and he looks interesting or she looks interesting, and they require things that are so new and exciting. And listen, that sounds exactly what we find in the world today. You know, I want to worship God, but I want to come to church and be excited. Listen, I'm excited by coming to church. I don't come to church to be excited. I'm excited to be at church. I'm excited to be in worship. I don't come here for some sort of a spectacle or show, but boy, there's a lot of people that went to church this morning simply because they knew they were going to have a spectacle. There was going to be some entertainment. I was going to be mesmerized by what was going on. So nothing has changed, right? Solomon said that nothing's changed. Nothing's new under the sun. But it kind of shows our parallel to the world. We want to get as close as we can, and we think that we can be an influence for good. Now, is there something to that? Yes, and we are to be an influence for good. But the idea that we can dip our toe in sin and we can be the example to the sinners when more likely than not, we're going to be the ones dragged down into sin by those who are in sin. We're strong, but we're not always that strong. Okay? So here's what happened. The Israelites began to take a little bit, get involved a little bit, partake a little bit, and then pretty soon they find themselves washed away in this flood of iniquity. And then what would God do? He would send punishment, He'd send relief, and then they would come back to Him. And then they would do it again. And every successive generation, it got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. Much like the people in Canaan. Same exact thing. All right? So, let's see. That's our introduction. We're going to go just a couple more minutes, and then we're going to stop. Just look at. Let's go to. Let's go to the first part, chapter 1. Remember, Joshua had just left the scene. He had just passed. And even now, they're still looking what to do. And look at what he says. After the death of Joshua, here's a great thing. What did they do? The people of Israel did what? Chapter 1, verse 1. After the death of Joshua, the people of Israel did what? Yeah, but what does it say they did? They asked who? The Lord. Interesting how that works. They want to find out what they're supposed to do. And rather than relying on their own judgment, what do? They inquire of God. Wouldn't that be a good lesson for us all to learn? That when we're trying to figure out what we need to do, the first thing we do is ask God. No matter what it is. What should we do in our worship? Well, let's ask God. What do we do? What do I do about this job? Well, let me ask God. What do I do about finding a spouse? Well, let me ask God. Where should I move? What should I do for a living? Who should I associate with? What movies should I watch? What books should I read? Well, let me ask God and see what He has to say. We need leadership. Who should we ask? Let's go ask God and see what's going on. So right off the bat, they're off to a good start, aren't they? They had made this promise to Joshua that they're going to serve God, that they're going to drive out the inhabitants, they're going to do everything that God tells them to do. So the first thing they do is they say, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord. And He asked them a very common sense question. Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? All right? Tell us what you want us to do. And the Lord does what? When we ask Him, what does He do? He answers. He always answers. We don't know what form that answer is going to take. Sometimes it's not what we're expecting, but He always answers us. He says, and the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. And He talks to Simeon, his brother. And the idea here is that, of course, Judah and Simeon were from the same mother at the very beginning. They were always closer probably than any other two tribes in the nations. Even Joseph and Benjamin were not as close as Judah and Simeon. But he goes to him and he invites him. And when it says that Judah and Simeon, it's not talking about the actual men, of course, because those people are gone. It's talking about the elders of that group, of that tribe. And they asked each other, let's go up and fight with each other and let's deliver this. Let's take care of this business right now. So they go up and they fight. And what does it do? In verse 4, Judah went up and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into the hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. And now here's a little bit of an interesting kind of a lesson. I think that a lot of times we kind of maybe skim over because it's kind of a gruesome type of lesson. But look what he says. And verse 6, Adonai Bezek fled, but they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And we think, wow, man, that's brutal. That's gruesome. Reason, of course, you take off the thumbs of someone and you've essentially crippled them in many ways. You cut off the big toes, they can't flee. Have you ever seen somebody try to run without big toes? It doesn't work too well. It's a humiliating tactic, and it's to show their absolute mastery of this man. He has been subject. He is now a subject to the rulers of Israel. But look at what he says in verse 7. And Adonai Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. And look at this verse the last part of this verse. As I have done, what? So God has repaid me. That's a lesson right there, isn't it? As I have done, God has repaid me. Whether it's good, if we do good, what will God do to us? He'll repay us with good. If we do evil, what is God going to repay us with? He's going to repay us with evil. So this is a giant lesson. It's a giant lesson for the Israelites, and it's a good lesson for us today. You know, we got to be careful of what we do. How do we behave in the flesh? How do we behave in our bodies? We talked about that this morning. What do we do in our bodies? Do we use our bodies to glorify God, or do we use our bodies to sin against Him? There's only two choices. All right? So here's Adonai Bezek, and he was a wicked man, and he did these horrible things to these other men, and now the same thing is being visited upon him. It also gives us an indication about the law that was going to be passed by God regarding the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and a hand for a hand and a foot for a foot, all of those things. God is going to mete out justice, and that's essentially what he does here. So there they are. It also goes to show that the enemies of Israel were not these poor innocent victims that were just being brutalized by the Israelites. These were a wicked group of people. They were sinners against God in the extreme. They were not only idolatrous, but they were murderous. Their behavior towards people that they captured, their behavior towards each other in the different cities that they lived in was absolutely abhorrent behavior, and God was going to punish them for that behavior. Okay? All right, we're going to stop here. We kind of gave an overview or an idea about what's happening in Judges. And next week, we're going to get into a little bit more of the actual book and talk about some things. All right. Anybody got any questions? Anything they want to bring up before we finish? All right. I encourage read over a couple of chapters before next week because we're not going to take a very long time on each one because a great deal of it is simply a narrative. But we are going to look for some of the lessons that we have to learn from there. There is something, and I meant to make this announcement before we started. A friend of McKin, and the reason I say this is because we're going to extend the invitation. We want to pray for and with people. And this is a name that I'd like to put in front of you. A friend of hers from Band, her name is Lydia. And Lydia had a couple of seizures a couple of days ago, and she is going to be going to the neurologist to see if they can figure out what's causing those. But she had a seizure. She was getting ready for school, or getting ready to go to Band with them, and she had a seizure and ended up falling and hitting her head on the tub. So she had a couple of injuries to go along with it, and now they're not exactly sure what's causing these things. So I would ask that you'd remember her. We'll get the information put in the bulletin. I appreciate you remember that little girl in your prayers. It's a very scary thing when they don't know exactly what's going on. But they did do some scans, and they didn't see anything, any kind of tumor or anything like that on the brain, which is, that's always a good thing. So, but I will get more information as we go. But I would appreciate you putting her before your in your prayers. Is there anyone here who needs to partake of the communion this morning, this afternoon? Okay, we don't have that. But we are going to have a song of invitation. 382 is our song of invitation. And what we want to do is we want to be able to pray for you and with you. If there's anything that anyone needs, let us know while we stand and while we sing.